Okay, so today is really only the hardcore that is left. That's good. Okay, so let us just continue where we left off a couple of weeks ago. So we are working our way through this marvelous sutta, the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, the Buddha's final days, final passing away, his trip walking from Rajagaha in the south all the way to his final destination, which is Kushinara, way to the north and a little bit northwest of Rajagaha. And we have now arrived at the river Ganges. He has just crossed the river Ganges, and then he's continuing north. And some of these places that we're going to talk about now, they're not really known through archaeology. The next one here is a place called Kotigama, and then after Kotigama he goes to a place called Nadika, and both of these places are kind of obscure in the sense that nobody knows where they are. They haven't been discovered through archaeological excavations or anything like that. But of course, after Nadika is very close to Vesali, and Vesali was at the time of the Buddha one of the great cities at that time. In the same sutta later on, they talk about the 6 great cities of India at that time, and one of those great cities was Vesali. When the Buddha is about to pass away, Venerable Ananda says to him, "Why are you passing away in this Kushinara, this kind of tiny little town with kind of no significance? Why on earth are you passing? You should pass away in one of these great cities like Vesali, Rajagaha, Savatthi, Kosambi, Saketa, and what's the last one? What is it again? Champa, that's right, the 6 great cities at that time. So that was one of the great cities. And of course, there are archaeological excavations at Vesali to this day, so you can go there and see some of those excavations. It's quite out of the way, so Vesali is one of those quite nice places to go when you go on a pilgrimage over the Ganges plain here. Anyway, so let's see what this second section has to say here. So it begins as follows. The Lord said to Ananda, "Let us go to Kotigama." "Very good, Lord," said Ananda, and the Lord went with a large company of monks to Kotigama and stayed there. Then the Lord addressed the monks thus: "Monks, it is through not understanding, not penetrating the 4 noble truths that I, as well as you, have for a long time run on and gone around the cycle of birth and death." What are they? And maybe just to stop there, first of all. So the 4 noble truths are now coming up next. And it is interesting, of course, that, as I mentioned before, one of the ideas of the Mahaparinibbana Sutta is for the Buddha to be able to summarize his teachings, to talk about those things that are important in his life. It's kind of laying down his legacy. What are the things that people should remember after he's passed away? So the fact that the 4 noble truths are here may or may not say something about the 4 noble truths. It may say something about them being very central to the Dhamma, or perhaps it doesn't. It's a bit hard to know sometimes, but that is certainly one possible explanation for why they're here. So as always, when you want to know whether something is a core explanation of the Dhamma or not, as always, you do a bit of comparative study. You look at this sutta, you compare it to other suttas, you see whether the 4 noble truths are also found in the same spot in other parallel suttas. So we have the Mahaparinibbana Sutta happens to exist in a large number of versions. You have a Sanskrit version of that, you have about 5 different versions in Chinese. So you look at those other versions, and what you find in this case is that it's only the Pali that actually has the 4 noble truths in this particular place. The other versions have something else about the understanding, virtue, samadhi, and panya, and also the final release, etc. So that is interesting in its own right, because one of the things very often these days we talk about the 4 noble truths as some kind of umbrella, some kind of umbrella term which kind of encompasses all of the rest of the Dhamma. It's a very common way of regarding the Four Noble Truths. But so does that mean that when the Buddha talks about his Dhamma, is kind of that the container that we use? Is that the bird's eye view that we take? Is that the crux or the kind of the essential summary of what the Dhamma is about? Is that the Four Noble Truths? Or is it something else? It's often regarded as that. But is that really the case from the viewpoint of the suttas? From this sutta, it may seem like that. But then when you do the comparative study, it actually turns out perhaps it isn't after all. And one of the things that you find when you read the rest of the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, and you also read the other suttas where the Buddha is kind of laying down his legacy, saying those things that are important to remember after I pass away, those things are always reckoned to be the 37 Bodhipakya Dhammas, the 37 aids to awakening. That is what the Buddha says. This is the core. This is the thing you should remember for posterity, and to keep on chanting together or talk or reciting together, so as to keep intact for future generations. The 37 aids to awakening. And of course the 37 aids to awakening are all about the practice, they're all about the path. Noble Eightfold Path, 7 factors of awakening, 5 spiritual faculties, 5 powers, 4 satipatthanas, 4 iddhipadas, the 4 factors of spiritual power, if you like, and the 4 right efforts. So they're all about the practice. And that is what the Buddha says. This is the essence of the Dhamma. This is kind of the crucial thing that should be passed down to future generations. And that occurs in a number of suttas. So that is interesting because when you look at the history of Buddhism, you can see how things tend to change over time. That which was the essence of the Dhamma at the time of the Buddha has perhaps changed over the centuries and the millennia and become something else. So I would say, rather than regarding the Four Noble Truths as the final say of what the Dhamma is, the 37 Bodhipakya Dhammas, 37 aids to awakening, that is what I think the Buddha himself would have called the essence of these teachings. That is it's a small point, but it's interesting because it changes the priorities a little bit. The Four Noble Truths are more often a bit theoretical. The 5 khandhas are suffering. It sounds theoretical when you hear it. It's hard to kind of relate to directly. I will talk about this a bit more in a second. How we can relate to this in a way that actually makes sense for us. But the 37 factors of awakening, or aids to awakening, they're all very practical, very hands-on about what we need to do to make progress on this path. So there's a slight change in emphasis there, which is interesting. Why is it that the Four Noble Truths have gained such why they are said to be the essence of the Dhamma in this particular way? And I think one of the reasons for that is because when you look at one of the suttas in the Majjhima Nikaya, the greatest sutta of the elephant's footprint, Majjhima Nikaya 28, there you have Venerable Sariputta. He says that the Four Noble Truths, all good teachings, they are included within the Four Noble Truths. And then he analyzes the Four Noble Truths, pulls them apart. And I think from that point of view, that is where this idea that the Four Noble Truths are kind of the final say in what Buddhism is about, I think it comes from there. But that's Venerable Sariputta. And then when the Buddha speaks, actually, I think it looks slightly different. So I'm making a lot out of something which may not perhaps make that much difference. Because what is interesting, it's almost as if you take any facet of the Dhamma, you take the Four Noble Truths, and then when you pull them apart, within that you have the Noble Eightfold Path. You have all the other factors are really there. Or you take the Noble Eightfold Path, you pull it apart, and you have the Four Noble Truths within that. Or you have dependent origination. If you look at it, the Four Noble Truths are also included in there. It's almost as if you can take any aspect of the Noble Eightfold Path, of the Dhamma, and you can kind of, once you start pulling it apart and analyzing it, everything is almost included within anything else. So it doesn't really perhaps matter that much. The only thing that is important, I think, is to keep it practical and pragmatic. So that is just very briefly about the Four Noble Truths. And then the Buddha said, it is by not understanding, so in other words, by insight, penetrating, by patividda, patividda I think it is, these Four Noble Truths, that you and I have been going around samsara for such a long time. And again, it's interesting here how the Buddha says this, how you and I have all been doing this. And I think, again, the point of this is to say that we are in the same boat. Yeah, whether it is me, the Buddha says, I have now become a Buddha, but essentially I have been in exactly the same predicament as you. There's no difference between you and me. These teachings are both for you, and they are the teachings that I myself used to reach awakening. We are in the same boat. We are both human beings. We have the same problem. Yeah, so it's like the Buddha is almost like deliberately saying that he is one of us in a sense. And the later Buddhist tradition, where they elevate the Buddha up into something completely different, I think is another dangerous place to go, because it misses the point of what the Buddha is all about. The Buddha is the kind of example par excellence of what you can do in your human condition. The highest, the upper limit of what can be done as a human being. So the Buddha and others are the same. And this is one of the points I think he's making here by saying, I as well as you have for a long time run on and gone round the cycle of birth and death. And I think the Pali words here is sangsarati. Sangsarati is the verb form of samsara. And the other word is sangdavati, and they're very closely related to each other. And they have this idea of moving on, sangsarati, going round and round and round, without any goal, without actually going anywhere. Bhikkhu Bodhi translates this as roaming around. And I think roaming around is a really nice translation for this, because the idea of roaming is kind of random. You're not going anywhere. You're just going here, roaming there. Like roaming from street to street in the city means like completely aimless, no purpose, not actually going anywhere. And this, I think, is kind of one of those things about the samsaric existence. We are not actually going anywhere. We're just moving from A to B, doing the same things, life after life. And there is no real goal in all of this. It's just this eternal moving on. So I think the word roam is actually quite a nice translation for the word sangsarati. Sangsarati related to samsara, the verbal form of samsara. Literally to samsara, to run around aimlessly. And what is interesting about that, I find, is that when you look at ordinary people's lives, when we look at our lives, it often feels as if it has a purpose. It feels like we have an aim. When you start off at school and university, kind of looking forward to your exam, you have an aim, moving towards something. Then you get yourself a job, and you want to be successful in your job. You want to get into a relationship, you want to have a nice house, and you want to have a good retirement. It's all about aims. It feels like we're moving towards something, this sense of actually going somewhere. So our experience of our lives is actually very different from the reality that the Buddha discovered, which actually has no purpose. It is this eternal moving around, not going anywhere, doing the same thing again and again, coming back to square one, like snakes and ladders, bang, down to the bottom again. But never actually coming to the top, never finishing it. After a while, you get fed up, kind of, falling down to the bottom again. I never played snakes and ladders, but I heard rumors about it. You kind of fall down, is that right? You get bitten by the snake, and then bang, you go down to the beginning here. But there is no ending, Snakes and ladders are supposed to have an ending. It's supposed to be a finishing line. This one has no finishing line. If you ever make it to the finishing line ties up with the beginning again. So you start off at the beginning here. And this is kind of the problem with samsaric existence. And this, I think, is one of those things which is so kind of desperate about it. And that's why seeing it, when you recognize and you see rebirth for the first time, it actually seems quite horrible, because you recognize that there is no point to this whatsoever, just going around and around and around. And again, it's very different from how we normally experience our own lives. And that is a very This is why this idea of right view is so important. Right view at the beginning of the spiritual path, because it informs us on how our practice should be and what the purpose of our practice is. So anyway, so that is what the Buddha says. It is by not understanding, not penetrating these Four Noble Truths, that we have been going around this samsara for such a long time. So that is the problem. So this is one way of looking at the Dhamma, looking at it from the point of view of the Four Noble Truths. So what are they? By not understanding the noble truth of suffering, we have fared on and roamed on by not understanding the noble truth of the origin of suffering, the cessation of suffering, the path leading to the cessation of suffering. We have fared and roamed on the round cycle of birth and death. Okay, so let's stop there, because the next part here is a little bit different again. So these are the Four Noble Truths. Maurice Walsh has compacted it and contracted it quite a bit. They are quite more kind of said in full in the Pali. So how do we relate to these Four Noble Truths? I'm not going to talk about them in great detail, because we talk about these things all the time, at least on retreats and that sort of thing. But I'm just going to talk very briefly about how to relate to these Four Noble Truths. Yes, the first noble truth of suffering here. How can we relate to that in a practical way that actually gives us an impetus on the spiritual path, helps us in our practice? So the Four Noble Truths are often talked about. You have the birth is suffering, old age is suffering, etc. And then the last thing is, in brief, the 5 aggregates of grasping, or the 5 khandhas are suffering. That is the very last step. I kind of summarizes the noble truth of suffering. Yes, the 5 khandhas are suffering here. And very often, I have noticed in my life as a monk, people very often ask, what are these 5 khandhas? And you can, that's form, feeling, perception, will and consciousness. But what are they? I just told you. No, but really, what are they? And the point is that it's quite hard to grasp. It's kind of very theoretical. There are these 5 things, but actually, what do they really mean? Apart from just kind of reciting a list which doesn't really have any impact on you. And the answer, of course, is that the 5 khandhas, they are our experience moment to moment. What you are experiencing right now is the 5 khandhas. There's a degree of consciousness there, awareness. There is a feeling to what you are doing now. There is a perception to what is happening. There is perhaps a will, because you're directing your mind in a certain direction. There is form. You can feel the form or whatever it is. So 5 khandhas are there right now. That is basically, it is just a particular way of analyzing our experience in the present moment, and also analyzing our experience over time. That's really all it is. So when we say that the 5 khandhas are suffering, you're saying in a sense that experience is suffering. So one way of relating to this that is quite nice is to think about your meditation practice. When you meditate, when you become more peaceful, what is it that you see when you become more peaceful? And what you see is that the 5 khandhas are gradually being eliminated. These 5 personality groups are being reduced, they're being narrowed down. The scope for what they are is becoming less and less. You're experiencing less and less feelings, and after a while only good feelings. The bad ones are disappearing. Your perception is narrowed down to the breath. Afterwards even more narrowed down when you come to nimittas and that sort of thing. The physical body disappears, rupa is disappearing. Your will is dying down because things are becoming more peaceful. So one of the things that you can see there right away, 5 khandhas are suffering. When there is less of the 5 khandhas in your meditation practice, there is also less suffering. You're narrowing things down. There's less things going on. So you start through the process of meditation, you can directly experience for yourself that the 5 khandhas are in fact suffering. The less there are of them, the better you feel, the more you abandon of them. Actually, the more happy everything is. And And this is a very beautiful, a very practical, and very straight to the point way of dealing with this noble truth of suffering here. And as you see that, you start to understand the meaning of suffering itself. Instead of it just being a theoretical idea in your head, instead of just kind of reciting the 5 khandhas, you start to understand what this is about. And then you can start to extrapolate. Yeah, okay, if I eliminate this much, I feel less suffering and more happiness. What if I eliminate even more? Yeah, what if I eliminate even more beyond that? And you keep on going, eliminating more and more. And as you do that, suffering becomes less and less, and happiness becomes less and more. more and more. Well, I hope that can be erased from the recording, otherwise I might get into trouble as a Buddhist teacher. So, all of that gets, and this is how to make it incredibly practical. And you can actually see directly for yourself this relationship between suffering and happiness and the 5 khandhas, how it actually works together. And this gives you an idea what this is about. And of course, as you take that further and further, you can start to see why the ending of almost everything, eventually the ending of everything, why that must be the highest happiness, because you're just extrapolating from the present experience. So that is the idea of the noble truth of suffering. Then we have the noble truth of the origin of suffering. The idea that craving is the cause of suffering in this world. And again, it's useful to also get some kind of handle on what this actually means as a practical reality. How is it that suffering is the cause? Craving is the cause of suffering. What is going on here? And from the Sutta's point of view, the idea here is that craving is the cause of rebirth, the cause of future lives. And because it causes the 5 khandhas, it creates the 5 khandhas into the future, it must be the cause of suffering. Because the 5 khandhas are suffering, if you create rebirth through craving, you are creating more 5 khandhas. Ergo, you are creating suffering in the future. That is all kind of nice, and it kind of makes sense. But sometimes it's nice to bring it back into the present existence, because rebirth is uncertain. It takes a degree of confidence to actually accept that. It's often good to, again, bring it back into the present experience. And the way to do that is not to say that craving causes suffering in this life, because in this life it is really more true to say that craving actually is suffering. If you crave a lot, you feel a sense of absence, you feel separated from where you want to be and all of that. Craving actually is suffering. It is a sense of dissatisfaction, a sense of being incomplete, etc. But there's another nice way of looking at craving and how it causes suffering in this life. And that is to go back again to dependent origination. So in dependent origination you have the idea of craving, tanha being the cause for upadana being attachment or the taking up of things. And then from upadana you have bhava there means existence, quite literally. So in dependent origination, just looking at those 3 terms, you have craving. Craving is a natural aspect of what it is to be a human being, because when you feel, you have to crave, because you want the good feelings, you don't want the bad ones. Because we crave, we tend to pick up things in the world, take things up. We take things up like a religion. We become Buddhist. We take up living in a house, we take up relationships, we take up friendships, we take up a job, we take up enjoyments of certain things. All of this is taking up. You're attached to things, you grasp onto things. And craving makes you do that, because that gives you a source, a way to satisfy your craving in this life. You pick all of these things up, and once you pick things up, that means that you are attached to those things. It means your mind is concerned about these things, precisely because you are attached. So what we mean by upadana paccaya bhava, that taking up is a cause for existence, what it actually means is that your existence right now, your psychological existence, what your mind is doing, comes from the things that you have picked up in this life, the things that you are attached to, and also the craving that comes before that. And one very nice way of knowing what that is just to go on a meditation retreat or even meditate at home or come here or whatever it is, but especially perhaps on a retreat, and just to sit back and relax. And the first few days, as you sit back and relax, the mind kind of calms down, yeah? And after the mind has calmed down for the first few days, and the mind is still busy, yeah, the initial kind of calming down has happened, but the mind is still thinking. Watch where the mind habitually goes back to all the time. Where does the mind go? What is the mind interested in? What are the things that you always go back to, that you always take an interest in? And you will find it is things like your job, your relationships, certain pleasures that you have in life. That is where the mind tends to go back. And that is where you know, this is my existence. Yeah, I exist here among these things. This is what my mind is interested in. And that is why it goes back to those things all the time. Yeah, so what you are seeing here, you're seeing is how your craving ultimately gives rise to the place where your mind hangs out in ordinary life, where your mind kind of tends to go back to as a kind of default in your life. That is what what is happening here. Craving leads to the mind hanging out in certain places. And then what happens is that as you practice the Buddhist path, as you purify yourself to some extent, as you learn how to become peaceful in your meditation practice, what you find is that your attachments are changing. Instead of being attached to all these kind of external things about your career and all these other things, you start to become more attached to the Buddhist path. Yeah? Is that good or bad, being attached to the Buddhist path? Actually, I think it's quite good, because you've got to be attached to something, so you're attached to something positive, yeah? Attached to grasp onto the Buddhist path, you cling on for dear life to all these wonderful things on the Buddhist path. And by doing that, you are changing the things that you are attaching to in life. Your craving is changing. Now what you are craving is to come to the Dhammaloka Center, to listen to DN16, yeah? Mahaparinibbana, that's what you crave for. It would be good if more people crave for that, actually. Today there's only about 25 people here. We need to arouse more craving in people for coming for the Mahaparinibbana Sutta. And because when you crave for that, then your mind is actually moving in the right direction. You're picking up things, you are grasping onto things, attaching onto things that actually lead to a different bhava, a different existence. And now, when you come to your meditation practice, instead of thinking about your job so much, about your relationships, about your pleasures in life, instead, what you find, your mind tends to become peaceful. Because that peace is where the attachment to the Buddhist practice, it leads to peace instead. Yeah. Or if you fantasize about something, it might be different kind of fantasies. Because you're developing your mind, you start to fantasize about new things, think about new things. But ideally, you just become peaceful as a consequence. Because that is the result of attaching to the Dhamma. The result of that is peace. You don't really start fantasizing about generosity, or about keeping the precepts. It's a kind of boring fantasy. Oh, I'm going to keep the precepts. You can only think about that so much. After a while, you get fed up with thinking about that. So then the mind just becomes peaceful, and that is the idea of that kind of fantasy here. So notice that in your life. Notice where your mind tends to go as a default. Yeah, when you go on a meditation retreat, notice how that changes over time. Yeah, how suddenly, because your mind attaches to other things, the default position is also different. And what you are seeing there is you're seeing how craving leads to existence. Because that default position of the mind, the bhava, the existence that you have in this life, is also roughly equivalent to where you get reborn in the future. Yeah? So you can actually see right in this life, you can see kind of where your mind is heading in the future by looking at that mind, which is, you find in your meditation practice or whatever. Yeah, so this is how you can see these things. Craving being the cause, or being the cause of suffering here. Suffering being the five khandhas. The five khandhas is what you experience in your bhava, in your existence. And you can see how those five khandhas become more refined. As they become more refined, you are lessening that suffering, because your craving is becoming less and your craving is changing as well. Okay, I hope that makes some sense what I'm talking about, and we're not kind of just makes good sense to me, but I never know about the audience. Always a bit hard to know. So I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't make sense, please feel free to ask questions at any time, and please say, "Oh, I can't understand a single word of what you're saying." That's perfectly okay just to say that as well. Okay, then we have the noble truth of the cessation of suffering. Yeah, and this is very similar to what I was saying before in the first noble truth. You can experience this in your meditation practice as your meditation becomes more peaceful. You can see how as the 5 khandhas go down, there's less suffering and there's more happiness in your meditation. And you extrapolate, and you can see where the whole thing is heading in the future. And the last one is, of course, the path leading to the cessation of suffering, being the Noble Eightfold Path. And again, that is more practical. But you can see that one of the ways that you can see this path taking off is the first three noble truths are about suffering, the cause, and the ending. So the more you understand of those first 3 noble truths, the more powerful will be your practice of the Noble Eightfold Path. Why? Because the Noble Eightfold Path begins with right view. Yeah, and the first 3 factors of the first 3 noble truths are really about right view. So once you get to understand those, you put those into the equation on the first part of the Noble Eightfold Path, and that tends to push the Noble Eightfold Path forward, because you understand about suffering, you understand about happiness, you understand where you have to search for these things and look for these things. So that also then drives the Noble Eightfold Path itself, just that right view at the beginning here. Okay, so those are for you just the 4 noble truths in brief, just to kind of look at them from a slightly different angle from what we normally do. I think it is so important in the Buddhist teachings to make things practical, to make them meaningful, to make them something that touches you in such a way that it actually empowers the path and makes you move forward. Yeah, it's so important. Otherwise, things just becomes theory, and theory is not really all that useful. What we're trying to do here is to end suffering, and we're trying to get better lives. So it's so important to make these things hands-on and tangible and practical. Then the Buddha says, and by the understanding, the penetration of the same noble truth of suffering, of the origin of suffering, of the cessation of suffering, and of the path leading to the cessation of suffering, the craving for becoming has been cut off. The support for becoming has been destroyed. There is no more re-becoming. So here the Buddha is saying that he has achieved this. He has achieved the understanding and the piercing through of the 4 noble truths. So it has happened. Somebody has in the world has seen the light and got rid of the darkness. They have seen the path and know what's going on. And because somebody has seen that, it makes it possible for others to follow along the tracks of the Buddha. Yeah, so he's basically saying, cheer up. Yeah, but it's good news. I have found the answer to this. This is not just theory. I have actually discovered this for myself. And what I have seen is the highest happiness, the elimination of all suffering. Boy, you should be so happy that I have discovered this, because now I can teach it to you, and you too can practice the same thing. The eye of the world, the Buddha, the eye of the world has opened up and seen reality for it actually is. And now I can pass on that reality to you, so that you too can achieve the highest happiness and the elimination of all suffering. Yeah, actually, it's really powerful. Yeah, it's incredibly powerful. Here is a person who has actually found the answer to the highest happiness in existence, the elimination of all suffering. Right? The only reason we don't jump up in joy, the only reason we don't, is because we can't really grasp it properly. If we grasp properly, we would say, yay! Yeah, you'd all be jumping up now, up and down, and saying, yes, please, give me the 3 refuges one more time, because this is so wonderful. Yeah, the highest happiness in the world, right, is there for your taking, and you're not jumping up and down. We should. So it's actually incredibly powerful when you think about it. It's kind of amazing. It's actually too amazing. You can't really believe it, right? That's the problem. The highest happiness in the world. Whoa, jeepers. Somebody actually discovered this. We still have it available. Wow. Actually, it is incredibly beautiful and extraordinarily powerful. And again, this is one of the reasons why it is so useful to reflect on this teaching. When you start to understand what the Buddha actually is, it should give rise to joy every time you bow down to the Buddha. Yeah, every time you bow down to something that represents the Buddha. This is not the real Buddha, of course, but it represents the Buddha. You should kind of have tears in your eyes because it's so powerful. I recently read one of the teachings of Ajahn Ganha. Ajahn Ganha is this very beautiful monk in the northeast of Thailand. He was a monk there at the time when Ajahn Brahmali was also a monk there. And he gives these incredibly simple teachings. And one of his teachings was, when you bow down to the Buddha, be happy. Yeah, very, very simple. But of course, the idea is to imbue your practice with happiness. To understand what the Buddha really is should fill you with very, very high degree of hope and happiness that there is something very beautiful and powerful in this world. And the Buddha is here saying, I have seen this. I know everything about suffering and happiness. Now you practice along, come along, and you will also be able to attain the same thing. Good, isn't it? Yeah? I think it's really, really great. So this is about really getting into this and understanding what it's all about. So the craving for becoming, or the craving for existence, quite literally, has been cut off. The support for becoming has been destroyed. The support, the bhavaneti, is like the thing which leads to becoming, sometimes called the conduit to existence. The thing that leads you, drives you on to existence has been cut off, which is craving, of course. And there is no more re-existence after this, is the last one here. So it has all been laid down and established and sorted out. Okay, so this is what the Buddha taught at Kotigama, and then he summarizes what he has just said, and this is very common in the suttas. Often you find a prose part, and then you find a verse afterwards that summarizes the prose. Sometimes the opposite, you have a verse and a prose which summarize the verse. But here the verses kind of summarize the prose. Not seeing the Four Noble Truths as they are, having long traversed around from life to life, these being seen, existence, conduit being pulled up, sorrows or suffering's root cut off, rebirth is done. I think it sounds more poetical in Pali than in English, probably. Pali is very nice. Pali poetry is all according to the length of the syllables. So there are a certain number of syllables in each line, and the syllables have a certain sequence to them. So there's a certain rhythm. These are called meters. A meter is how the number of syllables and the length of the syllables, how they are. And there's different types of meters in Pali, and they all kind of nicely, they go according to the same rhythm, So it's very rhythmic and nice. In English, of course, you lose that. You can't have that in English language or in most modern languages, I would think. Anyway, then let us continue. Then the Lord, while staying at Kotigama, gave a comprehensive discourse. Or actually, he gave many discourses, is the proper translation here. This is morality. This is stillness. This is wisdom. Stillness, when imbued with morality, has great fruit and great benefit. Wisdom, when imbued with stillness, has great fruit and great benefit. The mind imbued with wisdom becomes completely freed from the corruptions. That is, the corruption of sensuality, the corruption of craving for existence. False views, you can erase that one. And the last one is the corruption of delusion, of avidya, is the very last one there. And this is one of the refrains that you see throughout the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, this particular teaching. It goes almost every town the Buddha goes to. He teaches this particular teaching, yeah? And it's also the same in all the parallel suttas. You can go to the Sanskrit and the Chinese, and they all give you exactly the same thing. It has the same thing there. So how come? Does he actually say this? Is this what he says? And of course, this is not really what he says. This is a summary of what he is saying. Yeah? Here it is very clearly a summary, because what you are seeing here is the path in brief, what the path of Buddhism really is in brief, starting with morality, going to stillness, going to wisdom, and leading with the destruction of the asavas, or the ending of the asavas, that are here called the corruptions of the mind. Yeah? So this is a summary, and of course the way the Buddha would have expressed this in reality as he was moving from one town to the other one would have been very different. So it was obviously a broad spectrum of teachings, the gradual training here, the Noble Eightfold Path there, and different ways of expressing this. But what this shows us is that this again is then probably one of the safest bet. If you want to say how the Buddha summarizes his teachings, or how the Buddha kind of draws out the essence of the Dhamma, this will be one of the ways of looking at the essence of the Dhamma. Yeah? How morality leads to stillness, how stillness leads to wisdom, and how this thing flows on naturally from one to the next one. So this here is really just another way of talking about the gradual training. The gradual training which is so common in the suttas, you find it almost everywhere, where you have a large section on how to practice the sila, right? You have the sense restraint, you have the full awareness or clear comprehension, you have the passage on contentment in there, the abandoning of the 5 hindrances, the practice of the jhanas, and then you have the 3 higher knowledges at the very end. Yeah? So that's the gradual training, and this is really just a compressed version of that very gradual training, which you see throughout the suttas. So this again shows us, here we are getting to some of the very essence of the Buddhist path. And it's very similar to the 37 Bodhipakya Dhammas, 37 aids to awakening I was talking about before, because that too is just a practical, how to implement the practice. Yeah? And here again is about the implementation of the practice. But it's a very simple way of describing it. And if you remember that much, you remember so much about the Buddhist teachings. So what this tells you, it tells you, well, if your stillness isn't good enough yet, is there anyone who has too much stillness in here, in the mind? Yeah? It's pretty rare, right? It's very rare to find somebody, I got too much stillness. Unless you're falling asleep. That's kind of called miccha samadhi, miccha stillness. It's very rare that people get incredibly good samadhi all the time. So why is it that your samadhi isn't as good as it should be, or that you would like it to be, or it hasn't reached the potential of the path that the Buddha is talking about? Why is that? Well, this tells you straight away. It's because your sila isn't deep enough yet. Yeah, you haven't practiced enough sila yet. That's the reason. Your morality isn't pure enough. Yeah, so what should you do? You have to look at yourself. What am I doing wrong? Maybe I get upset and angry sometimes. Okay, how can I reduce my anger a bit further? Yeah, this is the kind of thing that we have to look. Remember, morality in Buddhism is very broad, and because it is so broad, there's an enormous amount of things we can do in the area of morality and sila. And of course, then there is the good aspect of sila. How can I be even better? How can I be even kinder? How can I use my mouth as a gift to other people? Every time you open your mouth, you can either give a gift to others or you can say something detrimental. Yeah. How can you kind of make every word you say a gift to other people rather than something that brings other people down? Once you start thinking like that, it becomes it becomes incredibly challenging to live like that, of course, but also very interesting, because here you are building up those causes for stillness and samadhi to happen. That is the problem. That is why samadhi isn't deep enough. And of course the same thing for wisdom. Why isn't wisdom good enough? Well, it says right here, stillness isn't deep enough. Yeah, the samadhi hasn't been established yet deep enough. That's why the wisdom isn't deep enough. Samadhi is the cause for wisdom. And then when that wisdom eventually happens, that is where you get the ending of these asavas, here called the corruptions of the mind. The corruption of sensuality of craving for existence, the bhava tanha, or the bhava asava here. False views you can take out because it doesn't really belong there. The other version of the sutta, even in the Pali, hasn't got that there, and it doesn't really belong there. But ignorance does. That's the avij asava, the corruption of delusion, really. And that is where all that comes to an end. No more delusion, clarity, seeing things according to reality. And when you do that, you have no more sensuality. Sensuality is gone. Why? Because it is a lower kind of happiness. You have achieved a higher kind of happiness. No more desire to exist. It's kind of weird, right? No desire to exist at all. You want to kill me? Yeah, it's up to you. If you want to kill me, yeah, I don't really mind. Either way, it's fine with me. It doesn't really matter. Can you imagine that? It's hard to imagine. But this is essentially what the Buddha is saying here. In fact, Venerable Sariputta is famously said to, in his verses in the Theravada, which are the verses of the elders, of the elder arahants in particular, both male and female, he's supposed to have said that being an arahant is like a workman waiting for his wages, or a workwoman, I suppose, waiting for her wages. You have done the work, you finished the path, now you're just waiting for the highest happiness when you pass away. It's kind of remarkable. Now, to understand these asavas a little bit, it is perhaps useful to compare them to the three kinds of craving. You may remember that when we talk about craving, we often talk about three kinds of craving. You have the craving for sensual pleasures, you have the craving for existence, and you have the craving for annihilation or non-existence. And you can see it tracks very closely what we are seeing here. It's very similar to this. So asavas is just another way of looking at the idea of craving, really. So sensuality here, of course, is what we have here. Craving for existence is the same as the corruption to desire existence. And the last one, the avijja, ignorance, has a lot to do with the idea of the sense of self. You have a sense of self, that is kind of the root problem, the root delusion inside of us. And that is very closely related to the craving for annihilation, to not exist. Because that craving not to exist is based on the sense of self, because you want to destroy yourself, you want to commit suicide, you had enough of this life for whatever reason, whatever the reason might be, but that is based on a delusion. It is similar to the Dhamma in some ways, but it is based on a delusion. So these are actually quite closely related to each other, because that delusion is also the delusion of a self, very closely related to the delusion, the avijja that you have here. That gives a bit more grip on what these asavas are. They're very closely related to tanha and craving. The mind going out, the mind seeking things in the world. So there you are, this beautiful little passage. And this passage, I've talked about it before, earlier on in this course, because we've already seen it a couple of times before. But it's almost enough. If you remember that passage 2.4 there, and you take that with you, that's almost enough to base your entire Buddhist life on that little passage, because it just has everything really in there. It's really Dhamma, condensed Dhamma, a bit like condensed milk. Here we get condensed Dhamma instead. So there you are. Okay, so let us go on to the next one. Please, as always, please stop me if you wish. John takes up the offer straight away. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. You replaced the word concentration with stillness. It sounds like that's just a replacement, but it actually, it's really different, isn't it? To use the word concentration for meditation is completely wrong.
Yeah.
And to just say stillness, it's just not a replacement, is it? Could you sort of explain that a little bit more?
Okay. The Pali word is samadhi, yeah? And the way usually that samadhi is described in the sutras is described as a mind coming together, the mind unifying, or is called, or also one-pointedness. The mind is kind of reached one-peakedness, if you like. If the mind reaches one peak, it's really the mind coming together that it actually seems to mean. The etymology of the word, what it actually comes from, is slightly obscure. Because the word samadhi is a very ancient word in India that existed before the time of the Buddha. It goes a long, long way back. And exactly its roots and how it is used now or used at the time of the Buddha may not be all that closely related to each other. But so one way, because it means the idea of coming together, one way of translating it, I know that this is what Ajahn Sudato translated as convergence. Yeah, convergence, because the mind converges together. All the aspects come together into one thing, and it unifies in a sense. And I think that is quite a nice translation. I think it certainly gets to kind of the idea of what it is about, that the mind converges. I feel the word is perhaps, to me, it's a little bit too cold, perhaps, convergence. It doesn't kind of have any emotional impact on me. When I hear convergence, it kind of leaves me a bit cold, to be honest. But when you hear a word like this, is the advantage of the word like stillness. If you don't know the exact meaning of the word, then I think it's often better to find a word which gives a general idea of what samadhi is all about. And I think stillness is quite nice in that sense. Because the mind does become still, it becomes unified, there's no movement anymore. This is a very important aspect of this idea of unification of the mind, no movement. So I think stillness is very suitable, and stillness to me has much more of something that you can relate to much more immediately. You know what it means. When somebody says that, you think, that makes sense to me, and it kind of has some kind of emotional impact, if you like, a feeling impact, because you know what it is all about. So it is a very hard word to translate, and I think certainly Ajahn Brahmali is right to say that concentration is unfortunate, because it tends to mean using a lot of force in the mind and all these kind of things. So it is a matter of, judgment, what actually is the appropriate thing to use in this particular context. You happy with that, John? Yeah, great, good. One happy customer. Okay. Anyone else wants to say anything here at this point? Okay, everybody is clear. Good. Okay, so let us continue a little bit. When the Lord had stayed at Kotigama as long as he wished, he said, "Ananda, let us go to Nadika." "Very good, Lord," said Ananda, and the Lord went with a large company of monks to Nadika, where he stayed at the brick house. So now we have come to Nadika. The Buddha is moving towards Vesali, the ancient capital of the Vajrayan kingdom, soon to be swallowed up by the Magadhans, moving that direction, very close actually now to Vesali, as far as I understand it, and is now staying at the brick house. It's kind of strange that a house is called the brick house. It makes it sound as if it is a rarity. In those days, if something is singled out as a brick house, it means that your average house wouldn't be made of brick, because otherwise there wouldn't be any point in calling this one the brick house. So there must be some purpose behind this. And I think the purpose here is that what we are seeing here, and this fits with the archaeological excavations in India that have been done over the last few centuries, and that is that there are very few material remains from the time of the Buddha. The only kind of material remains they have, which are roughly from that time period, are like vast, enormous kind of walls that encircle the cities. Like these ramparts of clay that were built up, and these ramparts, these walls, they have withstood kind of the ravages of time, etc. So they are still found, and some of those ramparts are reckoned to be almost from the time of the Buddha, perhaps as far back as the time of the Buddha himself. There's also the famous stone walls in Rajagaha, which you can see in the present day. Those two are talked about in the suttas, where they build a wall around Rajagaha, and quite likely, quite possibly, the walls you see in Rajagaha today were at least started at that time. They're perhaps the successors, if you like, or the further development of walls that were built already at the time of the Buddha, because it actually talked about in the suttas the building a wall around Rajagaha. And soon after the Buddha's time, Rajagaha was abandoned as a city, or not abandoned, but it became a minor city because the capital of the Magadhan Empire was moved from Rajagaha to Pataliputra. So after that, it wouldn't have been so important to kind of defend Rajagaha anymore. So it's quite likely that those walls are very ancient that you find there. So, and this is why this is interesting, because here you have the brick house. It would have been one of the very few brick houses at that time. Basically, there wasn't much brick production. Brick production really started at around the time of Ashoka, about 150 years after the time of the Buddha, and that's where we find the first really significant material remains from this period of India in Indian history. Prior to that, there is nothing, or you have to go back to the Indus Valley civilization, which was a long, long time before that, to find other material remains, but not at the time of the Buddha. So it fits again with history, that this should be the brick house. It kind of stands out as a special type of house in those days. Most things would have been made of wood, would have made of sticks. You would have these wattle and daub houses, where you have mud or cow dung, which kind of plastered on the walls, and that would have been the houses. So houses that weren't very strong. They would have very easily been destroyed by fire or by floods and that kind of stuff, and fallen over. Or very often they would have been made on stilts, stilts standing up, so flood could go underneath, and then wood on top. And of course then the fire again would have been very devastating for those kind of houses. And the word here for brick house, the word for brick is ginjaka. So I don't know if you think that's exciting or not. Probably not, you're not too impressed by that word. But the word ginjaka is interesting, because if you look at the Vinaya Pitaka, the code, the monastic code for the monks and the nuns, there is a different word used for bricks. And the word used for bricks there is itta. Itta is the word used. So how come there is two different words? And the reason is apparently that not so long after the Buddha, they started to use different word for bricks, and the new word for bricks was itta, the one you find in the Vinaya Pitaka. So this word then took over, and you don't find the word ginjaka after the Buddhist period, or shortly after the Buddhist period. This word ginjaka disappears, and a new word takes its place, and the new word is itta. So what is interesting about this is that language changes. And because language changes, it goes through certain periods when certain words are used, certain grammatical forms are used, certain ways of phrasing things are used. A new time period comes in, new words are used. Things change. And this word for brick is one of those words. So this is why this word is so exciting. So if you are interested in Buddhist history, this is really exciting, because what you're doing here is that you can look at the timeline of various things, and you can kind of classify things according to the words used, what time period they belong to. So whenever you see the word ginjaka, you know it's from the very early period. When you see the word itta, you know it's from a later period, because that is the later word. And this allows us, one of the ways that allows us to say that the Vinaya Pitaka, not all of it, but parts of the Vinaya Pitaka, come from a later period, because the vocabulary it uses actually is from a later period. Whereas this word ginjaka belongs, it seems, more to the very earliest period. Now there is a very interesting inscription in India. This inscription was only discovered in the 1980s. And it's interesting how this is a Buddhist site called Deor Kotar, maybe a site you have never heard about before. And this Buddhist site was found in India by surveying the Indian landscape. They surveyed the landscape of the Ganges plain, and they could see that there were certain Buddhist monuments. You had like the Buddhist monument of Sanchi on one side, and then you have Bharut on another side, and Bharut and Sanchi are really far apart. And then you have other Buddhist monuments, of course, like Bodh Gaya and all that kind of stuff. But by surveying the landscape, they could see that there was something missing in between those two sites. There should have been something there. This is a really interesting way of doing archaeology. You just survey the landscape, maybe using satellites or whatever, and then you decide from the surveying where you are likely to find Buddhist monuments. That's what they did. Something is missing here, so they went there, and then they saw a mound in the terrain, started digging, and lo and behold, that right there was a Buddhist monument. This is how they found this Buddhist monument. It's really kind of fascinating. It shows you what you can do by just being clever with your resources. And then they started digging. This was started in 1985. The real excavations was done towards the end of the 1990s. And one of the things that they found there was remnants of stupas and some artwork and all of these kind of things that you expect finding on a Buddhist site. But one of the very exciting things they found there was an inscription. And one of the words on that inscription, what that word was, it was Ginchika. This is why I'm getting so excited about this word Ginchika. You can start to see things coming together now. So what that helps you, because that word Ginchika was discovered on that inscription, it tells you something about the antiquity of that inscription, how far back it goes. It must go back to the very earliest part of the Buddhist period, because otherwise that word wouldn't exist anymore, because other words were taken over later on. So that Buddhist inscription is one of the very earliest pure Buddhist inscriptions found anywhere in India, possibly the very earliest one. Of course, the Ashokan inscriptions were earlier, but they're not pure Buddhist inscriptions. This is a pure Buddhist inscription, possibly the earliest of all the pure Buddhist inscriptions in India. And it's a very interesting inscription. It has been dated by archaeologists to the first half of the 2nd century BC, so 200 to 150 BC roughly is where it belongs. And one of the things that you have there is you have a lineage of like monks or maybe masters or whatever you want to call them, starting with the Buddha. It starts with the Buddha and then says the disciple of the Buddha was Anuruddha. You can only guess, but presumably that disciple would have been the Anuruddha that we read about in the suttas. And then it has, nobody's quite sure exactly how many people it is, but approximately 13 monks, starting with the Buddha, ending up with the present-day monk, whoever that is at the present day. 13 steps. The reason they're not quite sure how many it is, because some of the characters have been erased, you can't read them properly, so they had to guess roughly how many people are there, how many characters kind of fit in between. I think 9 names are readable and the rest are unreadable. So there you have a lineage, going back to the Buddha. This is almost like the first direct evidence almost of the Buddha that you found anywhere. It talks about the Buddha in direct lineage to the present time at that time. Roughly 250 years after the Buddha, something like that. And then you have 13 or 14 generations a monk in between that. And they have calculated that this is a very imprecise science, of course, but they reckon that if you take one generation to be 15 to 20 years, then that makes the lifetime of the Buddha around 400 BC, 450 to 400 BC, maybe even a little bit later, which kind of fits fairly well with the modern consensus of when the Buddha lived. So you can see how many of these little pieces, bits and pieces of the archaeological jigsaw puzzle, they all kind of fit together and they make the kind of, you're getting very close to the Buddha here. It's almost like you can start to see the historical Buddha in front of you. It's only a few generations afterwards. The Buddha is mentioned there as the teacher of Anuruddha coming down. So it gives a very tangible feel to ancient Buddhism, the way it was in the Ganges plain at that time. So just thought I mentioned that inscription because one of the kind of more exciting archaeological developments in recent years, and that was only written up very recently. It was a paper that was written in 2013 with some of the foremost scholars in the world in these things actually put together what this inscription was all about. So it's kind of modern, very, very modern discoveries. And every time everything fits well together, right? You make a discovery and it fits with previous discoveries, it fits with what the text says. Every time it gives you an additional boost in confidence, if you need one, that is, an additional boost in confidence that these are real things. Everything fits together. What we're seeing here is history, both in the books, also on the archaeological record and the archaeological digs. Okay, so that is a little bit about the brick house in Nadika. And this is what happened there. And the Venerable Ananda came to the Lord, saluted him, in other words, bowed down to him, sat down to one side and said, Lord, the monk Salha and the nun Nanda have died at Nadika. What rebirth have they taken after death? The lay follower Sudatta and the lay woman follower Sujata, the lay follower Kakuda, Kalinga, Nikata, Katisabba, Tutta, Santutta, Bada. He just disrobed. Okay, anyway. Subada, all have died in Nadika. What rebirth have they taken? So he's asking about the rebirth of all of these lay people, or all these people. Why is he asking about the rebirth of all these people? What is kind of the point of that? And I think the point is, and we'll see this very soon in the way the Buddha answers this question, the point is to inspire people. Yeah, these were obviously good disciples of the Buddha. They've been practicing in the right way. What are the results of good practice? What happens when you do things in the right way? And of course the answer is you get some really good results. Yeah. So when you hear about somebody who is practicing well, somebody's getting some good results, you should allow that to inspire you. You should allow it to lift you up, to feel good about that. You think, wow, they have this wonderful thing. This is what we talk about mudita in Buddhism, the idea of sympathetic joy. Yeah, this is very much what this is about. You rejoice in other people's success on the path, and when you do that, you feel inspired, you feel uplifted. You know the path works, and because it works for others, it must also work for you. Yeah, this is the idea of being uplifted about these things. The path is a generic thing that applies to everyone. If other people get good results, you too will get good results from this path. This is kind of the beauty of asking about these things. So remember that. This is the kind of the right way of thinking about other people's success on the path. And it inspires you because it reminds you that these things really are possible. If it is possible for others, it is possible for you as well. And the Buddha replies, Ananda, the monk Salha, by the destruction of the asavas, the corruptions, attained in this life through his own knowledge, the uncorrupted liberation of mind, the liberation by wisdom. The nun Nanda, by the destruction of the 5 lower fetters, has been spontaneously reborn and will gain Nibbana from that state without returning to this world. The lay follower Sudatta, by the destructions of the 3 fetters and the reduction of greed, hatred, and delusion, is a once-returner who will come back once more to this world and then make an end of suffering. The lay follower Sujata, by the destruction of the 3 fetters, is a stream winner, incapable of falling into a state of woe, certain to attain Nibbana. The lay follower Kakuda, by the destruction of the 5 lower fetters, has been spontaneously reborn and will gain Nibbana from that state without returning from that to this world. Likewise, Kalinga, Nikata, Katisabba, Tutta, Santutta, Bada, Subada. Ananda, in Nadika, more than 50 lay followers have, by the destruction of the 5 lower fetters, been spontaneously reborn and will gain Nibbana from that state without returning to this world. Rather, more than 90, by the destruction of the 3 fetters and the reduction of greed, hatred, and delusion, are once-returners who will come back once more to this world and make an end of suffering. And well over 500, by the destruction of the 3 fetters, are stream winners incapable of falling into a state of woe, certain to attain Nibbana. So here is the Buddha really setting out this long list of people who have attained all of these various things. And there is a few things to be said about this list. The first thing, of course, was interesting is at the top you have the monk and the nun, first of all. And the monk here is said to be an arahant, the nun an anagami. And of course this points out, as we see always in the suttas, that arahantship is always exclusive to the monastic in the suttas. If, as a layperson, you happen to become an arahant, then you will enter the sangha straight away, because essentially it means that you have given up the world. And this gives us that balance, if you like, the slight distinction here between the monastic order and the lay Buddhists. The other thing that is interesting about this list, and I think an important thing to take into account, and that is the very large numbers that you see here. 90 people who have become non-returners. What is it, 300, is that what it says? 300, what is it, what happened to it? 50 and 90, 50 and 90, and then you have 500 afterwards. So, very large numbers of people who have become Aryans. You look around the world today and you ask yourself how many Aryans are there, and you wonder what is going on. How come there are so many here? Whereas in the present day, it's not very often that you think you have met somebody who happens to be an Aryan. So what is happening here? And one of the things that is happening here is that the numbers that you see here are very unreliable. These kind of numbers, remember we're here talking about a place called Nadika. It would have been a small town at that time. It's almost inconceivable that there should be 500 stream winners in a small town. It means a substantial proportion of the population would be stream winners. Like half the population, or maybe 10%, I don't know how many people were there, but it would have been a very substantial portion of the population. So these numbers are always, you should always take the numbers in the suttas with a big pinch of salt. If you compare the sutta here with the suttas in the Sanskrit and the suttas in the Chinese, the numbers fluctuate enormously from one sutta to the other one. And that fluctuation shows you that these numbers are there more as rough, not even rough estimates, that they're like kind of inspirational numbers that don't really relate to any reality behind it. And I think that is an important thing to realize. And the reason why it is important to realize, because often people think, wow, in those days, people must have been special, or it must be because they had the Buddha around, or because they had the great arahant nuns and monks around. That's why they were able to do this, And then you kind of feel, I better wait for the next Buddha to come, because now it is impossible to do this. And this can be the result of reading these things if you read them in the wrong way, thinking that somehow today we are lesser than people were at the time of the Buddha. And this is a very common thing in Buddhist circles. People say, I'm going to wait for Maitreya to come around, then I will practice, because now it is hopeless. There's no kind of areas around anymore these days. But that, I think, is completely the wrong conclusion to draw from this. The numbers here are unreliable. We're probably talking about a very small number of people who were Aryas. I would reckon a handful at the most. And then over time, these numbers have been misremembered, and things have been added in there which is not part of the origin. You can see that by cross-referencing the suttas. It's quite clear. So please don't take it the wrong way, because then it will just drag you down and stop you from pursuing this wonderful path rather than actually practicing it properly here. So the right way of looking at this is rather to rejoice that it is possible. We still have the Buddha's teachings today. We still have people today who are realizing these teachings. And because we still have that, the path is still open for anyone who is serious about it. So rather to rejoice that people actually had success on the Buddhist path, and they still have success today. Then you can even get a bit of joy out of this, and you can kind of lift yourself up rather than drag yourself down and make it a burden for you when you read these things. So that is the the right way, I think, of looking at that. All of these names too, you have all the names of the people here. If you look at the other suttas, there's hardly a single name in common with the other parallels of the Mahaparinibbana Sutta. And again, shows you that these names also are very kind of, are very unreliable in a sense. So we're not really reading history here, we're more almost like reading slightly legendary material. There's probably a core of truth, but a lot of added things on top. Yes.
What's mean by 3 feta and 5 feta? What does it mean?
Okay, yeah, thank you for saying that. I tend to skip certain things because we talked about those before. So if you don't understand what things mean, please ask, because that's an important point. So the idea in Buddhism is that you have different stages of awakening. Yeah, you become a stream enterer. Where are you from? Are you from Sri Lanka originally? Yeah. So a sovan. You ever heard about sovan? Yeah, sovan is a stream entry. Yeah, that is the first stage of awakening here. It's the first time you see the teaching of the Buddha, the eye of the Dhamma opens up, and you understand what the teachings are. Yeah? And then there is 3 more stages: Sotapanna, Sakadagami, which means a once returner. It means you come back to this world once more. Then you have the Anagami, which does not come back at all, which gets reborn in a higher realm. And then you have the Arahant, who kind of has finished the full awakening experience, the Arahant. So this here talks about different stages. So the Sovan is the one who has destroyed 3 fetters. Fetter here is like a tie, it's like a rope which binds you. Yeah, a fetter is something which binds you. So a fetter, it binds you to samsara. It binds you to the round of birth and death. So with each level of awakening, some of these ropes are cut. Yeah, so there's less things that bind you to samsara, less things that bind you to the round of birth and death. And as you keep cutting on these ropes, eventually you become an arahant. The first 3 ropes, the first 3 fetters that you cut are the stream entry. They are Sakaya Ditti, which is the view that there is a that there is a essence inside of you, that there is a self inside. Yeah, it literally means the existing body, the existing personality of you. That there is an existing personality in you. So that is the Sakaya Ditti, the overcoming of the grasping of virtue and vows, which means that when you become a stream entry, virtue becomes natural. You become naturally virtuous. You're always kind to people, pretty much. You don't have to grasp onto it anymore. Sometimes it's called the grasping onto rites and ritual, but it's actually an inappropriate translation. It literally means you don't grasp onto morality anymore, because morality becomes part of who you are. So the stream entry is naturally virtuous. And the last one is that you have no doubt anymore. You overcome the doubt. Yeah? Because you have seen the teaching for yourself in the mind's eye, you have no doubt about the teaching of the Buddha anymore. And then when you go up, when you're letting go of the 5 fetters, you're letting go of 2 more things. You're letting go of any sensual desire. You're not attracted to the sensual objects in the world. And also you let go of all ill will. All ill will is completely finished once and for all. And that's why you get reborn when you let go, when you abandon those 5 fetters, you get reborn in the Brahmaloka as a consequence, which is like the world of metta and karuna and compassion, all these kind of things. Am I making any sense? Yeah? Okay, great. Yeah, good. So that is the fetters. And when you become an arahant, you abandon even more fetters. So there's no fetters left whatsoever. If it is okay, I will just do one more paragraph. Or maybe I should stop there, actually, because then we are kind of moving. Let me just do one more paragraph, and I kind of set you up for the next one that coming sooner. Ananda, it is not remarkable that which has come. No, it is not remarkable that a person should die, but that you should come to the Tathagata to ask the fate of each of those who have died. That is wearisome to him. Therefore, Ananda, I will teach you a way of knowing Dhamma, called the mirror of the Dhamma, whereby the Aryan disciple, if he so wishes, can discern of himself or herself I have destroyed hell, the animal rebirth, the realm of the ghost, all the downfalls, the evil fates, and the sorry states. I am a stream winner, incapable of falling into states of woe, certain of attaining Nibbana. So here the Buddha is saying, oh, please don't ask me about everyone who has died. Too many people die. Yeah, it's just too wearisome. Let's kind of get on with real Dhamma practice instead of worrying too much about this. And then he is going to teach you this thing called the mirror of the Dhamma, Dhamma Dasa, which you can use to then decide for yourself if you have become a stream enter. Yeah. So this is kind of a nice way. So if you have any doubts about whether you are a stream winner, I'm going to teach you this mirror, or the Buddha is going to teach you this mirror about how to know whether you are a stream winner or not. That's kind of exciting, isn't it? Then you will know once and for all whether you are a stream winner or not. And so that is what comes up next. And that kind of, I think that is a good place maybe to stop for today, because otherwise we get too far into there's too much material to cover otherwise. But you can see here one of the great things about becoming a noble disciple, the Aryan disciple. This is like the stream enter or whatever. Means that there is no more rebirth in bad states. You are certain of attaining Nibbana. This is one of the great things about stream entry. So it's quite useful to be a stream entry, right? You have put behind you almost all suffering in samsara, and there's only very little left as a consequence. So that is what is coming up soon, whenever I next come back to Dhammaloka, I suppose. Not sure when that will be. So, there you are. Any more questions or comments before we call it a day? John? Yeah?
The Buddha, when disciples came to the Buddha, and he often told them that he was enlightened, and what he attained and what he hasn't. And you read in the suttas where, often start off with such and such a Brahmin says, there's a good report about Gautama, he's attained enlightenment, right? It's sort of inspiring. But nowadays, if it's sort of looked down on if it was known that a monk was enlightened, why is that? It would be just as inspiring as then, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it's a good point. It's interesting because it is inspiring, but I think one of the problems is that there's also a lot of overestimation around, right? So you have to kind of find that balance and be careful not to kind of believe everything you hear on the one hand, but also when you feel that there is good grounds for something, then allow yourself to be inspired. So not to kind of use the idea of skepticism to put people down or to be negative about it, but more just to suspend your judgment. Okay, I don't know in this case, I'm uncertain. Not to kind of make it into a negative thing, but just suspend your judgment. When you feel that there is good ground that somebody may have attained something, then that is the right time to rejoice and to be happy about it. So it's always that balance there between trying not to become cynical. Being cynical is very detrimental, obviously. Not going to work. So being realistic while not being cynical, and then being joyful and elated when something really is going well. So yeah. So thanks for that point. I think it's a good one. Yeah. Yes.
Ajahn Brahmali, I would like to ask, if you take the premise that the world Earth is a learning planet.
Yeah.
And we are reborn again because we are learning how to handle everything that we've been speaking about today and more in our life. And as we go through each stage of learning and all the aspects around it, that would surely assist us in our life of suffering.
That is true, but sometimes people think they're learning, but they're not actually learning. Yeah, this is one of the problems. So I have to make sure you really learn. That's the difference. And sometimes just going through the cycle itself is not actually enough to learn. how do you know that you have learned? The way that you know that you have learned is that you leave this life with more good qualities than you had when you started out. That's how you know you have learned something. So if you leave this existence with more mindfulness, more kindness, more compassion than you had when you were born into this world, you have learned something, and you will take that learning with you into the future, and if you're lucky, you will be able to continue the learning curve in the future. But some people don't do that. Some people, they go out of this world with worse qualities than when they started out. They have reduced their learning. Of course, if you have reduced your learning, you're not going anywhere. You're going in a bad direction. So it depends on what we make out of this our human existence. It is not automatic that we learn. Just because you suffer, just because you do things, does not mean that you're going to learn from it.
Thank you.
Very good. Okay. Yeah. Okay, from outside. Okay, very good. Everybody else is happy? Yeah? Okay. So, a couple of both of them from overseas. First one is from Laurel in the USA. How can the Buddha's Noble Eightfold Path, i.e. right effort, help with the fear of making mistakes and facing negative results, developing obsessive compulsive disorder-like habits? Thank you. So how can this path help you to overcome these things? And I think one of the reasons precisely why you have compulsive, obsessive disorder is often because there is some suffering in your life, and often these kind of disorders they get expressed because of that suffering. I don't know too much about it, but that's how I understand. These things are sometimes explained by psychologists. You go into these habit-forming things because you're trying to escape from something unpleasant in your life, and then you do things habitually because it is a way of escape, in effect. So the way that it works with the Noble Eightfold Path is that this entire path, as you practice it, it reduces suffering. So as you reduce suffering, that a tendency to fall into compulsive habits in this way will be reduced, because that suffering is no longer there that you need to escape from. So just by practicing this path, doing this step by step, attaining some more sense of peace inside of you, some more sense of happiness in your life, and if you are serious about the practice, you will be able to do that. Then the compulsion and the habits and all of that, the obsessions, they will start to diminish all by themselves. So don't judge yourself for having these things. I think this is one of the worst things. Sometimes we think that having obsessive compulsive disorder is a bad thing, it's negative. It's not. It is just a natural response to suffering very often. If you try to stop yourself from expressing this in this way, it often makes things even worse, because you're adding suffering on top of suffering. So just go with the flow. If this is what you want to do because it is an escape from suffering for you, it's okay. And then just learn from that and keep on practicing the Noble Eightfold Path. And as you do that, that obsession will tend to gradually be abandoned all by itself. Try to understand what is going on. What is the suffering that is causing you now to act in an obsessive and compulsive way? If instead of judging yourself, you just observe yourself, that is when you gain insight. If you judge yourself, insight is very hard, because judgment tends to suppress what is going on. It makes it very hard to actually be clear about what is happening. If instead you just observe, clarity arises, insight comes, and that is where a change becomes possible. So see if that works. So the same one again. And the next one is from Indira Fernando in Sri Lanka. Okay, hello Indira. I feel quite attached to the Buddhist path. Will this ensure I will continue the practice if I have future lives? Quite possibly it will do that. I guess it depends what kind of attachment it is, and whether it is whether it is a very healthy kind of attachment. It depends on whether it is perhaps an identity that you have, and all these kind of things. The most important way to ensure that you continue practicing the Buddhist path in the future, two things. understanding the Buddha's teachings properly, so that when you come to your next life, you think, whoa, I've been here before. I know this. There's something here, something I recognize with this. And then your mind will kind of naturally incline towards Buddhist teachings in the future. Obviously, it depends a bit where you get reborn. If you get reborn in an unfortunate place, then maybe the teachings won't be available so easy, which makes it more difficult. That's the first thing. And the second thing is to go as far as possible that you can on the path, so that your mind is as pure as possible. And then when you do that, it will also be easier for you to continue the practice from a higher level in the future. So understand the teachings as deeply as you can, experientially, ideally, and then also practice as much as you can. Then you have the best foundation for that. Attachment to the path is useful as well, but I think these other factors are even more important. Okay, so that is all for today. So let's just end off by paying respect to the Buddha Dhamma Sangha.